The ego is always associated with tension, always. And with the absence of it, there is just an inner relaxing. That's a great way of describing it, because it doesn't mean that you can't be experiencing grief or pain or, that there can't be some unpleasant emotion that's based in something really happening, going on. But there's even just an openness at being with it, right? Because there's no image associated. The moment that, that clenching in the image, because they come at the same time. They're coming at the same time. It's the thought, I'll be happy if I get over there. And the ego, they're with each little syllable, it's there. Just it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg. They're both, or they're just both arising, out of the words it's arising. And it's so quick, the way it comes into being, this image. And so even in unpleasant emotions, like if we can be with the sadness, like something real is going on, someone I love just lost someone she loves, to be with that sadness. We all have something like that going on. Maybe you've lost someone that you love, and you feel the sadness and you allow it to move through you. But what's different is there's not a story of how am me, going to get through this. I will never love like that again. This is so unfair. This shouldn't have happened. That's the ego, right? So we can be with sadness and grief and say like, yeah, someone passed. Yes. Thousands, probably tens of thousands of people die every day. There's a great line in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the early Hindu texts, where Arjuna is talking with, I think it's Krishna through the whole text, Krishna. And they're on a battlefield. The whole thing is based on this battlefield. Actually, not the Bhagavad Gita, is the Upanishads, like one of the early Hindu texts. Anyway, they're on this battlefield. And Arjuna asks Krishna, he goes, what is the most amazing thing in the world? What do you think is the most amazing thing? And Krishna says that people can be dying all around you, and you don't think it will happen to you, right? Like, we don't think it'll happen to us, and we don't think it'll happen to the people around us. And so the ego comes out, even in grief, in loss, in how it pushes back. This shouldn't be happening. Why did this have to happen? I'll never be the same, right? There's a little image of a little wounded me, instead of, yeah, it's sad that it happened. I'm going to miss that person. Or my heart breaks for this person who's going through this. And I can feel their sadness and I can feel their grief. And you can do it with compassion. Practicing compassion really helps us a lot to be with the pain and suffering. That's, again, what we did the last 2 Sundays on our Sunday Sangha talks. So go back and watch those classes if you weren't there. They're on the first one's on my timer page. The second one will be up in a few days, hopefully. Doing compassion practices, helping us to be with pain and suffering in a way that allows us to bear it without going into despair, to bear it without the ego. And Libby, what you're saying, yeah, I was saying like, that, when it's there, to realize it's there, and like with self-compassion, like, oh, sweetheart, yeah, that hurt. Oh, sweetheart, that was embarrassing. Like recognize like the embarrassment or something's there, but kind of quieting the ego down. Or even the story, I think actually what you might be referring to is in the story of the Buddha when he was sitting under the Bodhi tree and he said, I'm not going to get up from this. I'm not going to get up from this tree until I get enlightened. He'd already left home 7 years before, and he'd studied with a few masters, didn't quite get there, and then he tried the ascetic path, like I'm not going to eat anything, I'm going to meditate in the hot burning sun in the middle of the day, and like, man, that's not working either. So he goes and he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he's been there for a long time, and he's really seeing reality. He's starting to see how this is all happening, how all this is arising. And way off in the cosmos, Mara gets wind of this. And Mara is kind of depicted like as the trickster, as the jokester, but also the ego. So Mara hears that the Buddha is about to, the Buddha, then Siddhartha, is about to figure this out. And he's like, oh, I can't have that. He's flying down to earth. And he sees the Buddha, Siddhartha, sitting under the Bodhi tree. And he's like, oh man, he is just about to get it. And so he says, okay, well, I got to use the tricks at my disposal. So first thing he does is he magically appears beautiful women to try and entice him to desire, to pull the Buddha out of his deep state of samadhi where he was seeing everything so crystal clear. So trying to pull him out with desire, so that these women were trying to tempt him, dancing in front of him, very seductive, beautiful. And when Mara realizes, oh, that's not working, so he says, I know, fear, that'll get him. And then, so he imagines, poof, all these little demons, and they're throwing all these fireballs at Siddhartha. And as they get close, they just drop away, almost like little flower petals, not hurting him, not harming him, not disturbing his deep concentration. And Mara thinks, oh my God, okay, I've got one thing left to throw at him. Doubt. And so he says to Siddhartha, he says, who do you think you are? You think that you can know the nature of reality? Others have tried before you. Others that have meditated longer, that have studied longer. Who do you think you are? That you will be the one to be able to awaken, to be the enlightened one. And with that, Siddhartha, now the Buddha, presses his hand into the ground, and the earth shakes. And the Buddha says, the earth is my witness. And that's what that mudra is when you see the Buddha's hand resting down into the earth. And then after this, the Buddha, now the enlightened one, the awakened one, as the story goes, Mara would still come to visit the Buddha throughout his lifetime. And when the Buddha would see him, he'd go, there you are, Mara. I see you. Would you like a cup of tea? Come on in. What's going on with you today, Mara? Because he saw through Mara. He realized the ego is not something, we can destroy our identification with the ego. We can see through it. But the ego isn't real. It's just an illusion. It arises through specific kinds of thoughts about me. I want, I don't want. And all the judging and comparing and doubting and worrying and controlling and all of that comes under those two. I want, I don't want. And so it wasn't the Buddha wasn't afraid of Mara anymore. He's just like, I see you, Mara. So I think what Libby was referring to, so I used to say in some of the classes after I told that story, it's a really good practice, when you're having some doubt, you're having some worries, you're thinking about something you said and you're like, oh, that was so stupid, or something you did that was embarrassing. You said the wrong thing. You're like, oh, I can't believe I said that. That wasn't right. Right? We think about later. And then we go, I see you, Mara. I see you, Mara. I'm not buying what you're selling today. So it's not like we have to hide from it and just go, I see you. Like, I see you. I see you clearly. And I see what you're selling. And I am not buying. I am not buying today. So thank you for that reminder, Libby, if that's where you were meaning. Yeah. So, yeah, the ego, Mara, it's tricky. But we have all these little ways, all these little stories and, just different ways for us to pull back the veil, to see what is really going on. Yeah, and Diane, awareness is the key. Awareness is the key. And it's a little tricky with that as well, because, we spend so much time asleep, right? And yet there's a point where where we're being more mindful, we're consciously being more mindful, I do find heart-opening practices naturally bring us into a state of awareness, naturally help us to be more mindful. But there's effort in the beginning. Not so much effort if we just do apply a little effort to be kind, a little effort for compassion practices, heart-opening practice, that really sees us through. But then there is a point where that awareness is just always there. It's no longer effort, right? Like we apply the effort because we're so used to living in the dream of our thoughts, of our ego, the fantasy. We're so used to it. It's so second nature. And it feels so uncomfortable to be out of the dream for a few minutes. Like, I better get back up there. I was holding everything together in my thoughts. I better not be present for too long. I better not be aware for too long. Right? So we trust that dream so much more than we trust the awareness that's always here in the present moment. Right? And so it's, we keep applying the effort to be more mindful, to be aware, to recognize, okay, you're going to forget. Okay, no problem, begin again. And then you forget, no problem, begin again. And then you forget, no problem, begin again. Always being kind to yourself. No judgment. That's just the ego trying to come in another back door. Gotcha. Oh, now let me kick you from this side too. Right? So instead, kindness, just start again, begin again, begin again, begin again. And each time you do that, right, you realize you pull yourself out of it and you're like, oh man, actually it does feel a lot better. I can still think. I can think more clearly. The quality of my thoughts are remarkably better when they're not focused on me. I'm remarkably happier and more relaxed and at ease. Doesn't mean that things don't go wrong, but that I'm at ease because I recognize the ups and downs of life. I'm not fighting it anymore. And a lot more of it really is good that I wasn't paying attention to because I was so lost in the dream. And then, as you keep doing all the things that you should be doing to be awake, meditating, doing a wisdom practice, a mantra, concentration, your breath, vipassana, self-inquiry, tantra practices, whatever your meditation practices, but making sure it's balanced also with compassion practices. Opening the heart, that continuous priming of the heart, not just on your mat, but as you go about your day, practicing kindness, practicing compassion, practicing gratitude, forgiveness, contemplating, looking at the way reality is, looking at how it all keeps coming together. Like, it is amazing, amazingly interesting how each moment is arising. How we're arising in this moment, how this conversation is going in this moment. It's amazing how this all happens. And so doing all of these things and spending more time being aware, being more mindful, and then it just, as Matthew had said back there, like all of a sudden you have these insights. And, it's just, and not the ego is dead, so to speak. The identification with it is no more. Because I think what the Buddha's story was telling us, and what I know in just the experience here, it's not that the ego dies. It's that you don't identify with it anymore. And I don't even know that has to be 100% of the time. But just that you see it. I see you, Mara. I see you. I see you. And you stand, and the awareness then, the mindfulness, is then effortless. You finally trust this more. You finally trust this moment. Yeah. But the delusion is pretty convincing. And it's why we do all of these things. And you can see Nancy's putting a Rumi poem there, so I want to read that. Yeah, of the guest house, yeah, that we're kind of, yeah, the guest house I think is the body. I think, is that what I think in that room, I know the Rumi poem you're talking about. But also from Rumi, where he says, why do you stay in prison when the doors are so wide open? You know, we construct the prison in our thoughts. We put a little me in a prison. And I say this, I think I say this almost at least on Mindful Mondays. Please do not think for 1 minute that this is inaccessible to you. It is not. Meaning, seeing that the doors are so wide open. Seeing that there are no doors. This is not inaccessible. It is not something that only special people attain. It's who you are. And if you keep looking, if you keep paying attention to what is going on, using the practices to keep pulling yourself out so you can see how I was in the dream, I was lost, it was so convincing, it was so believable, and then I got out of it. And you keep doing it, and you do it over and over and over, and you apply kindness, and you apply compassion, and you remember the teachings of impermanence and interconnectedness and emptiness and karma. All of the teachings, that you keep going over them, but you also spend a great deal of your time, or as much as your time as you are able to, just disconnected from everything. I mean, even if you can only spend 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, where you're just sitting and doing nothing. You know, you're looking up at the sky, your dog's playing, your children playing. You're not looking at your phone, you're not listening to a podcast, you're not reading about it. You're being. We spend too much time, I say this constantly, because it's what was happening here for a long time. We spend too much time reading about what enlightenment is like. You're not gonna wake up reading about it. Someone had sent me a movie on YouTube recently, and I had seen the first part of this series many years ago. Maybe not many, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a part 3. But part 1 was simply people just talking about what enlightenment is. Why would I want to watch what people talk about enlightenment? You know, and I know in the past I wanted to hear about it, thinking that this was the way to become enlightened, to hear other people talk about it. Right? Not that there's not a certain amount of teaching that we don't need. We do need that. But to imagine that this was some like, oh, this is amazing, because they really were just talking. I didn't find anything particularly inspirational. But once you have that awareness, there's no longer an interest in hearing people talk about it, because it pales in comparison. It pales. It pales. I say all this, by the way, not claiming to be someone who is enlightened. There is no one to be enlightened, right? The ego thinks it's going to be enlightened. That's who wants to be enlightened, or that's who thinks it's going to be enlightened. But I say this as someone who has definitely seen this and lives mostly in the awareness of knowing this, of seeing how this all arises. There's a forgetting. There's for sure, moments of forgetting, and then just sudden remembering. So everything I share with you is what was done here. You've got to really look for yourself. You've got to see how it is all arising. See how connected it is. The heart is such a big part of this. Such a big part of this. And don't give up. Most of you are probably so much closer than you even realize. You are so much closer than you realize.